On his deathbed, Reginald Pierce, a once celebrated tycoon, called his estranged family to his bedside. With trembling hands, he whispered a confession that shattered decades of lies. "I replaced Edward, my business partner, with someone else. An impostor." Gasps filled the room, but Reginald's pale lips pressed on. Edward found out something he shouldn't have. He had to disappear. The man you all knew was never him. With those words, the truth began to unravel like a sinister thread. In 1978, Reginald Pierce stood on the precipice of a new era. Pierce-Lawson Enterprises, the tech company he co-founded with Edward Lawson, was on the cusp of revolutionizing the world with its latest innovation, an early prototype for a personal computing device. Investors were pouring in, and the media dubbed Reginald and Edward the dynamic duo of Silicon Valley. But behind the polished smiles and tailored suits, a storm brewed that would change everything. Edward Lawson was more than a business partner to Reginald. He was his oldest friend. They had met during college, bonding over late-night brainstorming sessions and a shared dream of building something that would outlast them both. Edward was the visionary, the man who could see beyond the horizon and inspire others. Reginald, on the other hand, was the executor, the one who turned Edward's ideas into reality. Together, they were unstoppable. Or so it seemed. The cracks in their partnership began to show when Edward stumbled upon discrepancies in the company's financial records. Late one night, as he pored over ledgers in his dimly lit office, he noticed a pattern of unaccounted withdrawals, millions of dollars siphoned off into offshore accounts. The transactions bore Reginald's signature. At first, Edward thought it was a mistake, a clerical error easily explained. But the deeper he dug, the more sinister the truth became. Edward confronted Reginald the next morning. His voice trembled with anger as he laid the evidence on the table. "Reginald, what is this? You've been embezzling from the company? From us?" Reginald's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed panic. "Edward, you don't understand. This money, it's not what you think. It's for the future, for our safety." Edward shook his head, his trust in his friend crumbling. "Safety? This is fraud, Reginald. People will go to prison for this." Reginald knew Edward well enough to realize there was no convincing him otherwise. Edward was a man of principles, a man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost, and that made him dangerous. Reginald couldn't risk Edward going public with what he knew. The fallout would destroy not only the company but also Reginald's carefully crafted reputation. In a moment of desperation, he made a fateful decision. That evening, Reginald contacted a man he had hoped never to deal with again, Victor Kane, a fixer with a reputation for making problems disappear. They met in a secluded booth at a downtown bar, the air thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken threats. Reginald slid a manila envelope across the table. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely audible. Victor opened the envelope and studied its contents. Photographs, documents, and a check for an obscene amount of money. He looked up, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "It has to be done," Reginald replied, his hands clenched into fists. "Edward can't be trusted anymore, but the company, our image, it depends on him. I need someone who can take his place, someone who can be Edward Lawson in every way that matters." Victor leaned back, the wheels in his mind already turning. "I know a guy," he said after a pause. "An actor, down on his luck, but good. With the right coaching, he could pull it off. But it'll cost you." Reginald nodded, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "Whatever it takes," he said. And so the wheels of betrayal were set in motion. Over the next weeks, Victor orchestrated a plan as audacious as it was sinister. The actor, whose name was deliberately kept from Reginald, underwent a rigorous transformation. He studied Edward's mannerisms, voice, and handwriting. He was coached on the intricacies of Pierce-Lawson Enterprises and underwent minor cosmetic adjustments. Meanwhile, Reginald kept Edward distracted with a series of business trips and meetings. He knew it was only a matter of time before Edward pieced everything together, so the replacement had to be ready. The final step came one fateful evening when Edward was lured to a remote cabin under the pretense of a private meeting. There, he was confronted by Victor and two enforcers. "Reginald sends his regards," Victor said with a cold smile before Edward was forcibly sedated and whisked away. The next morning, Edward Lawson appeared at the company's headquarters, his demeanor as confident as ever. Employees noticed he seemed a little off, perhaps tired or distracted, but no one questioned it. Reginald made sure of that. He had already planted seeds of doubt, suggesting Edward had been under immense stress. It was the perfect cover. As weeks turned into months, the new Edward seamlessly took over his predecessor's life. He attended board meetings, gave speeches, and even charmed Edward's wife, who struggled to shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. Reginald watched from the sidelines, his relief tempered by a growing unease. He had secured his empire, but at what cost? The specter of his betrayal loomed large, a constant reminder that some secrets refused to stay buried. The man who now called himself Edward Lawson stood in front of the mirror, staring at a face that wasn't quite his. The slight changes, a higher hairline, reshaped cheekbones, were subtle but enough to make him unrecognizable as Victor Crane, the struggling actor who had entered this charade. The training had been grueling. For weeks, Victor had been coached to mimic Edward's mannerisms, voice, and even his peculiar way of tying his tie. But no preparation could ease the weight of the role he was playing. Victor wasn't new to deception. As an actor, he had taken on roles that required him to lose himself completely. But this was different. This wasn't a character on a stage. This was real life, and the stakes were impossibly high. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and the facade would crumble, leaving him vulnerable to Reginald Pierce's wrath, a man who had made it clear that failure wasn't an option. Reginald spared no expense in ensuring Victor's success. From private lessons with dialect coaches to handwritten letters that Victor memorized until his penmanship matched Edward's, every detail was accounted for. But there were things money couldn't buy, like the genuine warmth Edward exuded or the way his laughter lit up a room. Victor practiced Edward's laugh for hours, but it always sounded hollow. The first test came during a quarterly board meeting. Reginald sat at the head of the table, his eyes darting to Victor every few seconds. Victor scanned the faces of the executives around him, knowing any of them could have been Edward's peer for years. If even one of them suspected something was amiss, the entire plan would unravel. "Edward," an executive said, pulling Victor's attention, "what's your take on the new proposal for expanding our operations in Europe?" Victor felt his chest tighten. He had rehearsed questions for days, but uncertainty lingered. Clearing his throat, he leaned forward, remembering Reginald's instructions. "Speak with confidence, even if you're unsure." "I believe the expansion aligns with our goals," Victor said, his voice steady. "But we must be cautious. The European market is volatile. I propose a phased rollout, starting with smaller cities." The room fell silent before the executive nodded. "Good point," he said. Reginald's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension in his jaw remained. Victor survived the meeting, but the pressure was far from over. Over the next few weeks, he was thrust into Edward's life completely, attending galas, giving speeches, and interacting with people who had known the real Edward for decades. Each encounter was a minefield. One of the most challenging interactions came with Margaret Lawson, Edward's wife. Margaret had been distant since Victor's first day as Edward. She was polite, but her eyes carried suspicion. Victor studied videos of Edward and Margaret, noting how Edward would touch her arm when they spoke or tilt his head when she laughed. Victor mimicked these gestures, but Margaret's smile never reached her eyes. "Edward," she said one evening over dinner, "you've seemed different lately. Is something bothering you?" Victor froze for a fraction of a second. Reginald had warned him Margaret might become an issue. "I've just been under a lot of stress," he said, forcing a tired smile. "The company, the new projects. It's overwhelming." Margaret nodded, but her gaze lingered as if searching for cracks in the facade. Victor excused himself early that night, retreating to Edward's study where he kept a journal, a habit Reginald had instructed him to maintain. But Victor's entries weren't for show. They were confessions, a way to unburden himself from the guilt gnawing at him. "January 12th, he wrote. "Margaret looked at me like she knows, or maybe she doesn't, but she feels something's off. I hate lying to her. She doesn't deserve this. None of them do, but I have no choice. If I fail, Reginald will... No, I can't think about that." Victor's isolation deepened. Reginald's control over him was absolute. He couldn't reach out to anyone. The only person who knew the truth was Reginald, and he treated Victor more like a pawn than a partner. Every interaction reminded Victor he was disposable, a temporary fix. One night, Victor found himself standing in front of a photograph of Edward and Margaret. Edward's arm was draped around Margaret's shoulders, his smile warm and genuine. Victor stared at it, his chest tightening with envy and guilt. He could wear the man's face, but he couldn't replicate his soul. The facade was holding, but cracks were forming. Victor's nerves frayed, and Margaret's suspicion grew. Reginald assured him everything was under control, but Victor wasn't so sure. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the house of cards came crashing down. Unbeknownst to Victor, Margaret had begun her own investigation. She hired a private investigator to dig into Edward's recent behavior, determined to uncover the truth. What she found would set off a chain of events none of them could predict. Margaret Lawson sat alone in the dimly lit study, the sound of a clock ticking in the background. Spread before her were the results of her investigators' efforts: photographs, documents, and witness statements that painted a picture she struggled to comprehend. The man who returned from recent trips, who shared her home, might not be Edward at all. Her instincts had been right. Something was deeply wrong. One photograph stood out to her. It showed Edward meeting with a man she didn't recognize. The investigator's report identified him as Victor Crane, a failed actor with a murky past. Margaret's heart pounded as she traced Victor's face. Though subtle changes had been made, it was unmistakably the same man now claiming to be her husband. Margaret clenched the photo, whispering, "Who are you? And what have you done with my husband?" Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret searched Edward's belongings. She found his journals, meticulously kept for years. But as she flipped through them, the entries from recent months felt off. They lacked warmth and depth, reading like cold summaries, an imitation of the man she loved. Tears blurred her vision as she held the journal to her chest, feeling her worst fears confirmed. That evening, Margaret waited until the house was silent. With careful steps, she entered the study where Edward often retreated. Rifling through drawers, she found a leather-bound notebook tucked away. Inside were Victor's confessions, entries detailing the charade Reginald had orchestrated and the guilt Victor carried. Her hands shook as she read the truth. Edward had been replaced. The next morning, Margaret struggled to maintain her composure. Sitting across from Victor at the breakfast table, she stirred her coffee with trembling hands. "Edward," she began evenly, "I need to ask you something." Victor looked up, his expression wary. "What is it?" Margaret placed the photograph on the table. "Who is this?" Victor's face paled. He recognized Victor Kane, the fixer Reginald had hired. I don't know who that is," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. Margaret leaned forward, her voice firm. "Don't lie to me. I've hired someone to look into you. I know you're not Edward. Where is he? What have you done with him?" Victor froze. For the first time since this began, he was exposed. He glanced at the doorway, half expecting Reginald to appear. But Reginald wasn't there. "Margaret, please," he began. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," Margaret demanded, tears streaming down her face. "What happened to Edward?" Victor bowed his head, guilt weighing on him. "Your husband. He's alive. Reginald had him taken away. I don't know where." Margaret recoiled, her mind reeling. Edward was alive. Relief clashed with rage. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would Reginald do this?" Victor hesitated, then confessed. Edward discovered fraud. Reginald was afraid he'd expose everything, so he replaced him with me. Margaret's stomach churned. Her husband had been betrayed by his closest friend, and this man, this impostor, had taken his place. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling with fury. Victor raised his hands. "Margaret, please, if I leave, Reginald will—" "I don't care," she snapped. "You've lied to me, stolen my husband's life, and expect me to feel sorry for you?" Victor lowered his gaze. "I didn't have a choice, but you do. If you want to find Edward, you'll need me. Reginald won't let him go easily." Margaret hesitated. As much as she hated Victor, he was her only link to Edward. Finally, she nodded. "You're going to help me fix this. But if you try anything, I'll make sure Reginald's lies come crashing down." That night, Margaret and Victor met in secret to plan their next move. Margaret involved her investigator, Daniel Harper, a man with a reputation for uncovering the truth. Together, they pieced together Reginald's web of deceit, tracing financial records, surveillance footage, and witness statements. Daniel's sharp insights helped uncover hidden accounts and shadowy connections that tied back to Reginald. Their investigation uncovered shocking details: payments to offshore accounts, records of falsified transactions, and a mysterious property owned by a shell company under Reginald's name. Margaret suspected this property could be where Edward was being held. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous their pursuit became. As evidence mounted, Margaret's resolve hardened. She vowed to bring Reginald to justice and reunite with Edward. But Reginald was a powerful man, and Margaret knew they were walking a dangerous path. Every step brought them closer to the truth, and to the edge of a precipice. Unbeknownst to them, Reginald had been keeping tabs on Victor. When he discovered Margaret's involvement, his paranoia deepened. He tightened his grip, ready to eliminate any threat to his empire. For Reginald, this wasn't survival. It was domination, and he intended to win, no matter the cost. Victor Crane hadn't known fear like this in years. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every sound an omen of his unraveling. As he and Margaret delved deeper into Reginald's web of lies, he couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. Reginald wasn't careless. The man built his empire on power and manipulation, and Victor knew crossing him was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. Margaret, however, appeared fearless. Determined to uncover Edward's whereabouts, she threw herself into their investigation, combing through evidence Daniel Harper had compiled. It was Daniel who finally provided the break they needed, a secluded property tied to Reginald's shell companies. The transactions connecting the property to offshore accounts traced directly back to Reginald. "This could be it," Margaret said, staring at the satellite image of the wooded estate. "Edward might be there." Victor's stomach nodded. "If we go there, we need a plan. Reginald won't let this slide." Margaret's eyes burned with resolve. "I'm not leaving Edward there for another second." Daniel, ever cautious, intervened. "This can't be rushed. Reginald has resources, security, surveillance. If Edward's there, he's being guarded. We need to approach this carefully." The plan was risky. Daniel would gather evidence strong enough to bring in law enforcement while Margaret and Victor confirmed Edward's presence. 2 nights later, under the cover of darkness, they drove to the property. Armed with binoculars and flashlights, they crept through the woods, careful to avoid triggering alarms. Margaret's heart raced as she spotted the main house, its faint lights glowing through the trees. Through binoculars, she saw guards patrolling the perimeter. "It's heavily secured," she whispered. "Edward could be inside." Victor nodded grimly. If Reginald went through this much trouble, he wouldn't keep Edward anywhere easy. They watched for hours, mapping the guards' movements and noting potential entry points. Margaret's determination never wavered, but Victor couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. The woods seemed alive, whispering warnings of the danger ahead. Meanwhile, Daniel worked tirelessly to build their case. He knew law enforcement wouldn't act without irrefutable proof. Reginald's influence extended far beyond the business world, and Daniel had no illusions about the obstacles they faced. Late nights of poring over documents and hacking encrypted files began to yield results. He uncovered hidden accounts, falsified transactions, and the names of those complicit in Reginald's schemes. Reginald wasn't ignorant of their efforts. His paranoia grew into obsession, with informants keeping him updated on their every move. He knew about the investigation, the property, and even Margaret's confrontation with Victor. It was only a matter of time before Reginald struck back. The first blow came as a warning. An anonymous message delivered to Daniel's office. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it," it read. Daniel pressed on but warned Margaret and Victor to be extra cautious. "Reginald knows we're getting close," he said grimly. "He'll fight back." Margaret was unmoved. "Let him try. I've already lost too much because of him." As the days turned into weeks, Margaret and Victor's surveillance grew bolder. On one night, they spotted a figure in an upstairs window, a man with disheveled hair and a gaunt frame. Margaret's breath caught. "It's him," she whispered. "It's Edward." Victor pulled her back into the shadows. "We can't act yet. We need to be sure." Margaret's frustration boiled over. "That's my husband. He's right there, and you're telling me to wait?" Victor met her gaze, fear in his own eyes. "If we move too soon, Reginald will know. We can't risk it." Reluctantly, Margaret agreed, but contacted Daniel to expedite his efforts. Daniel promised results within days, but Margaret knew time was slipping away. Every moment Edward remained in Reginald's grip was another moment of suffering. Then came the unthinkable. One night, as Margaret and Victor approached the estate, they found it swarming with activity. Guards moved urgently, their voices sharp and commanding. Margaret's heart sank. "He's moving him," she said, panic rising in her chest. "Reginald knows we're close." Victor grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." Margaret spotted a black SUV pulling out of the driveway, its windows tinted. "He's in there," she said, her voice breaking. "Edward's in that car." Victor pulled her into the woods as guards began sweeping the area. "We can't help him if we're caught. We'll regroup with Daniel." As they fled, Margaret's mind raced. Reginald was one step ahead, and the stakes had never been higher, but she refused to give up. Back at Daniel's office, the team regrouped, piecing together their next move. Margaret stared at the evidence they had compiled so far, her heart heavy but her determination unshaken. "He's not going to win," she said, her voice steady. "We'll find Edward, and when we do, Reginald will wish he had never crossed me." The tension in Daniel Harper's office was palpable. Margaret paced the room, her hands clenched into fists, while Victor sat in the corner, pale and drawn. Reginald had moved Edward, and now they were racing against time. Margaret's heart burned with hope and fury. She had seen Edward, barely, but it was enough to reignite her determination. "We need to think," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed anxiety. "Reginald wouldn't move him far. He's staying ahead of us, not disappearing." Margaret stopped pacing. "Then what's the next step? How do we find him?" Daniel pulled out a map of properties tied to Reginald's network. There are a few places he could realistically move Edward to on short notice. He circled 3 locations: a rural farm, a private airstrip, and a villa outside the city. Victor leaned forward, studying the map. "The airstrip," he said shakily. "If Reginald's desperate, he might move Edward out of the country." Margaret's stomach churned at the thought of Edward disappearing forever. "Then we start there," she said firmly. The plan was risky. Daniel would secure backup while Margaret and Victor investigated the airstrip. That night, they approached under the cover of darkness. The air was cold, and the distant hum of engines sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Through binoculars, she saw several guards stationed near a hangar, along with a private jet idling on the runway. "He's here," Margaret whispered. She could feel it in her gut. "Edward's here." Victor wasn't so sure. "We don't know that for certain. It could be a decoy." Margaret shot him a glare. "I'm not leaving without checking." They crept closer, sticking to the shadows. Margaret's heart pounded as they reached the edge of the airstrip. From their vantage point, she saw the guards clearly, 6, all heavily armed. Her stomach sank. They couldn't take them on without backup. Victor grabbed her arm. "We need to fall back. Wait for Daniel." Margaret shook her head. "If they take off, we lose him forever." Before Victor could stop her, Margaret moved closer to the hangar. She stayed low, her pulse hammering. Peering inside, she caught a glimpse of a man seated in the corner, his hands bound, head slumped forward. It was Edward. "Victor, it's him," she whispered urgently. Victor joined her, his face pale. "We can't do this alone. If we go in now, we're dead." Margaret hesitated. He was right. As much as it pained her, they couldn't act recklessly. She pulled out her phone and called Daniel. "We found him. He's in the hangar. We need help, now." Daniel's voice was tense. "I'm on my way. Stay out of sight." Margaret turned to Victor. "We wait, but if they try to leave, we're going in." Victor nodded reluctantly. The minutes felt like hours as they waited. Margaret's mind raced with memories of Edward, his smile, his laughter, the way he'd always been her anchor. She couldn't lose him now. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance. Daniel arrived with 2 plainclothes officers. Margaret's relief was short-lived as she noticed movement near the hangar. The guards were preparing to load Edward into the jet. "They're moving him," she hissed. Daniel and the officers moved swiftly toward the hangar. Margaret and Victor followed close behind. The confrontation was sudden and chaotic. The guards, caught off guard, scrambled to defend themselves, but the officers were well prepared. Within minutes, the scene was under control. Margaret rushed into the hangar, her eyes locking onto Edward. He was weak, his face gaunt, but alive. "Edward!" she cried, falling to her knees beside him. Edward lifted his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Margaret?" "It's me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe now." As the officers secured the scene, Daniel approached grimly. "This isn't over," he said. "Reginald won't let this go." Margaret looked up, her jaw set. "Let him try. I have everything I need to take him down." For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. Edward was alive, and Reginald's empire was beginning to crumble, but Margaret knew it wasn't just about Edward anymore. Reginald's network of deceit and corruption had ruined countless lives, and she intended to bring it all crashing down. Back at Daniel's office, the team regrouped, reviewing their next steps. Edward, though fragile, managed to recount bits and pieces of his captivity. He spoke of endless nights in isolation, veiled threats, and Reginald's chilling warnings about what would happen if he ever tried to escape. Margaret listened, her heart breaking, but her resolve only hardened. "You don't have to say another word," she told Edward, gripping his hand tightly. "We're going to make this right, I promise." Edward's weak smile was all the reassurance she needed. She turned to Daniel and Victor. "We're not just fighting for Edward. We're fighting for everyone Reginald has hurt. He doesn't get to walk away from this." The final battle was looming, and Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. But with Edward safe by her side and a team ready to stand against Reginald, She felt a strength she hadn't felt in years. The end was in sight, and she was ready to face it. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain as Margaret stood at the edge of the courthouse steps. Edward was by her side, still frail but determined, his hand gripping hers as if anchoring himself to the moment. Around them, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Margaret ignored the chaos, her focus solely on the man they had come to confront. Reginald Pierce, flanked by his legal team, emerged from a black SUV. His face was a mask of calm, but Margaret could see the tension in his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes. For the first time, Reginald was on the defensive, dragged into the light of public scrutiny. The evidence Margaret, Daniel, and Victor had uncovered was damning. Offshore accounts, falsified records, and testimonies from those he had manipulated. It had taken weeks to compile and even longer to convince the authorities to act. Margaret's heart raced as Reginald passed her, his eyes locking onto hers for a brief moment. There was no remorse, only a cold acknowledgement of the game they were playing. Margaret didn't flinch. She had fought too hard, risked too much to let him intimidate her now. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Reginald's lawyers were aggressive, painting Margaret and Edward as liars desperate to ruin an innocent man. But the evidence was undeniable. Daniel's meticulous investigation had left no stone unturned, and Victor's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. He recounted every detail of the conspiracy, how Reginald had orchestrated Edward's abduction, replaced him with an impostor, and silenced anyone who stood in his way. As Victor spoke, Margaret glanced at Edward. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes burned with a quiet strength. This was his moment of vindication, the chance to reclaim his life and expose the man who had betrayed him. Margaret reached for his hand, offering a reassuring squeeze. The trial stretched on for days, each revelation more shocking than the last. Former employees came forward, revealing years of corruption and coercion under Reginald's leadership. Financial experts testified about the elaborate web of fraud he had spun to protect his fortune. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the courtroom buzzed with whispers of disbelief. Finally, it was Edward's turn to speak. The courtroom fell silent as he stood, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. He described the betrayal, the fear, and the isolation he had endured, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Reginald Pierce didn't just betray me," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "He betrayed everyone who ever believed in him. He thought he could take my life, my identity, and walk away unscathed. But he was wrong." When Edward finished, the room erupted in murmurs. Margaret felt a surge of pride and relief. For the first time, she saw the spark of the man she had fallen in love with, a man who refused to be broken. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the evidence bearing down on them. Margaret and Edward waited in a quiet corner of the courthouse, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. Victor sat nearby, his expression unreadable. He had played his part, but Margaret knew the guilt of his role in Reginald's scheme would haunt him for the rest of his life. Finally, the verdict came. The courtroom was packed as the jury filed in, their faces somber. Margaret held her breath as the foreman stood, his voice echoing through the room. "On the charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, we find the defendant, Reginald Pierce, guilty." A wave of relief washed over Margaret as the words sank in. Reginald's expression remained stoic, but Margaret saw the faintest crack in his composure. For the first time, he was powerless, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. As the judge handed down the sentence, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, but she knew the scars of Reginald's betrayal would linger. Edward had been through hell, and their journey to rebuild their lives was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed again, their questions relentless. Margaret shielded Edward as they made their way to the car, their hands intertwined. When they were finally alone, Edward turned to her, his voice soft but resolute. "We did it," he said. "We finally stopped him. Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We did, and now we can start over." As they drove away, the city lights flickering in the distance, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The battle was over, but the future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities. Together, they would heal, rebuild, and reclaim the life Reginald had tried to steal. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, Margaret knew they would face them together.